questions for Reverend Kurti. So I'm a conservative Christian. I spend a lot of time with other conservative Christians, but I don't like them. I'm like a libertarian. I was just curious to know what you think about, I mean, it seems to me that lots of Christians talk about religious freedom and yet they want it for themselves and not necessarily for other people. So obviously all this stuff to do with same-sex marriage, it's clear that they want to not be forced to bake cakes, but if you get into the issue of, say, burqa bans or mosques or whatever, these seem to be pretty inconsistent. So just interested to know what you think about, I mean, how do you persuade people who theoretically believe in religious freedom to actually believe in it consistently rather than just looking for them to be protected, but then people they don't like to be kind of walloped by the state?
Come to the microphone to answer.
I know you can stay there. We'll just bring the mic to you.
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, that's a very good question. I think the way to persuade people is to tell them again and again and again and again, actually, which is what I spend my life doing. It's a very good question, though, because you're right. I think people, on the one hand, want they might think religious freedom is the freedom not to bake a cake, and let me just put some parentheses around that. Even this is an extraordinary example that has just dominated the popular imagination, because in fact, there are no instances in Australia of this having happened. There are a few instances in the United States, which is, of course, a very litigious country, and this went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The likelihood that a baker in a wedding boom that we're about to confront would say no is probably small. But if somebody wants to say that they don't want to bake a cake, they should be free not to. But it's probably not a good commercial decision. But that's one for an individual to make. But people are very quick to uphold the freedom to decline to bake a cake, and as you say, to ban the burqa. I'm very much in favour of allowing people to wear the burqa if they want to wear the burqa. I mean, when we're talking about the burqa, the burqa is not seen very often in Australia, perhaps in parts of Western Sydney, but it's mainly the niqab, which covers the nose and just leaves the eyes exposed, whereas the burqa is a full face covering. If according to the dictates of your religion, you think it's important, you feel it's important for you to wear the burqa, then I think you should be free to do so. I do assume, when saying that somebody who wants to wear the burqa is wearing it freely. Now, we know that there may be women who don't feel free to wear the burqa. Banning it is not going to address the lack of freedom that those women currently experience. Banning is accomplish nothing at all. So let's assume that people choose freely to wear the burqa, and we've heard the niqab, really. And we've heard many young Muslim women say that they choose to wear this vesture as a mark of their identity, as a mark of their religious identity. As Australian Muslims, they should be entirely free to do that. There are two provisos, if I may just say, just two qualifications. First of all, religious freedom is not an absolute freedom. It doesn't trump every other right, and therefore practices that are inimical to our civil society or that infringe, that break the law, are clearly unacceptable. So underage marriage, child marriage, will always be illegal in Australia, and rightly so. So it's not an absolute freedom. But if you choose to express yourself in a certain kind of way, then you should be free to do so. The burqa, of course, is a very contentious garment because it can easily be a symbol, and in the minds of many people, is a symbol of the failure of Muslims to integrate in Australian society. If you, as a Muslim woman, want to wear a burqa, want to cover your face in public, fine, but I think you do bear a responsibility for ensuring that it doesn't become a symbol of your own alienation. But I'm in favour of wearing the burqa, and I actually clash with a number of my colleagues on this because they think it's an unacceptable manifestation. It's an unacceptable presence in Australian society. I disagree with that. But thanks for the question.
Just, we've got, I'm going to go to Doug next, if Luke could take that down. Just before Doug does his question, I think one thing to look at is in Quebec, Bill 62, which actually tries to, or has a sort of secular charter which Quebec has, which will be interesting to follow. It's a bit further down the path than here. So, Doug, on to you.
Sorry, if we can just get your name and organisation as well. Doug Hall, Mannkal ambassador. Look, I'd really like to pick up on a point that Wolfgang made about this, well, I think towards the very end, which implied to me a dialogue between West and East. And I'm a great supporter of and believer in Western civilization. However, it does worry me when people start to corral it and a bit of chauvinism claiming it to be theirs. I'm currently reading a series of 4 books by Warwick Ball, an Australian Middle Eastern archaeologist. And each one of those books explores non-geographical European influences on Western civilization, so Arabs, Persians, Ottoman Empire and Slavs. And what he paints is a very rich tapestry, a dialogue in space and time, which has evolved into this thing we call Western civilization. So it does worry me that, and I'd like your comments about the need that some people have to identify it as theirs geographically or theirs in an Anglo-Saxon sense or a subcultural sense. Whereas it is an evolutionary project, as you stated, and maybe we need to be more generous and see it as a global project, certainly a Eurasian project, and leave it a little bit more open-ended.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we'll start with Bella, because I think you've done some research on this. Maybe not, or Peter, up to you.
Well, I also think
Or Wolfgang, okay. Please. Yeah,
He's
let's.
not been grilled yet. I think we should have
I
grilled.
shouldn't trespass here.
No, come
This is your panel. Yes, my personal attitude, as you probably inferred from what I said, is a wider catch than Bella's. It's not the Anglosphere. It is a wider, richer thing. Don't forget that the Usages, the constitution of these Visigoth kings, who I mentioned briefly, was centuries before Magna Carta. Where did these English barons get these ideas from against Roman law? Well, from generations earlier, these Germanic tribes who had trespassed. So I think we should make that a wider catchment than just British history. Civilization, our civilization, is much more. It's Voltaire, it's Kant, and all these other people, not only David Hume and Adam Smith and the people you quoted. Sorry. You asked me for it.
And Wolfgang, we've got a seat for you, Wolfgang, so you're now on our panel.
No, I mean, obviously I understand that Western civilization has absorbed, and I think that's one of the beauties of Western civilization, that it has absorbed and taken the best bits and perfected it, and other civilizations haven't. That's inescapable. And the British arrived here in 1788 with their institutions. They didn't arrive with institutions from Southeast Asia. We can't ignore those things. People have to know those things. And I'm not afraid to say that I think Western civilization is the greatest civilization. And I think what is great about it is the fact that it has taken from other civilizations and perfected them. And there's no comparison. And I'm not scared to say that it's the best.
I don't have anything to add, actually.
I agree it's the best.
We got a question up the back.
I'm Stephen Howarth, involved in promoting classical Christian education. And I've just got a question about one of the difficulties in teaching history is there are very few connections between the Australian curriculum history and once students get to year 11 and 12. So for example, they don't really get exposed to medieval history except in a very limited little bits and pieces on the Black Death and maybe a bit on the Vikings and that sort of thing. So I'm interested to know what you think about, and you can't also do medieval history in year 11 and 12 anywhere in Australia as an elective. So there's a big gap in terms of the actual teaching of history. And I'm interested to know what you think about the whole Frankfurt School and their influence on history as a teaching profession and what you think could be done about that.
Who wants to start? Yeah. Bella, over to you.
Well, what I know about the Frankfurt School is that they, I don't know where to begin to explain this. I mean, I'm sure there are people in the room that know a lot more about the Frankfurt School than I do. But what I've continually seen in the study of how history is approached at university and school is a sort of Marxist idea of oppressors and victims, and the oppressors versus the oppressed. And that the only thing that matters is history, again, and I repeat myself, through the lens of class, gender and race, And facts and things like medieval history are now completely unimportant. People don't want to know, and people aren't studying these things, so therefore they're not going on to teach them. We're stuck in a very vicious cycle. If they're not being taught at university, then they're not being taught to school children. So actually I had an interesting conversation with Simon Haynes, who's the CEO of the new Ramsey Foundation. And I said to him, look, where are you going to get people to teach Western civilization? And he's going to have to go to America to find people. So there's literally no one in Australia. They need maybe 15 people to teach the courses, and they haven't got the people because nobody knows, because the knowledge has been lost. It's not being taught to undergraduates, not being taught to school children, and people aren't looking at the books anymore. So they're going to have to go to the US, to liberal arts colleges, to be able to teach medieval history, to be able to teach the Enlightenment.
Just, Wolfgang, do you have anything to add?
I totally agree. The problem starts with high school. It's if you go to the notice board of any Australian high school and see what is pinned there under the history subject, it makes you despair. Feminism in the 18th century in Italy and hobby horses like that. But the overview, the cohesive history, the narrative spanning centuries. I mean, you try to find one simple source for a young Australian about the Papal Revolution, which for me is the beginning of Western civilization. Where is it? Where is a summary on 20 pages with a few sources that would inspire a young person to start studying history and civilization from there? It's just not here. You have to go to a French author who wrote this book that I mentioned, What is the West? It's translated. That's why I thought you have to bring a Frenchman to teach us a bit more about history.
Just before we go to back, Bella, in your study, you did the audit. Ron again and again says, the problems, yes, solutions. You flagged, and I think you adapted one potential approach. I think it was Professor Ferguson's suggested one, but you put some Australian elements to it.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about that? Because said we know there's problems, but I like to see what we could do. And I thought that was a nice approach. So can you just flag what you did and a bit about that?
Are you talking about the 20 core subjects?
Yeah.
Yes. So obviously, if you identify that something isn't being taught, then you have to propose, well, what should be being taught? Thank you. Neil Ferguson did a similar study of American universities, Stanford and Yale, last year, and he looked at what the undergraduates are learning really, and he discovered that they're not really learning very much. It's the same problem in the US as it is here. It's just all identity politics. So he said, well, this is what they should be learning if they are doing a degree in modern history. So he came up with 20 core topics that he thought should comprise a proper Bachelor of Arts in Modern History. So we just adapted his methodology, which is pretty strong, and said, well, an undergraduate studying history in Australia, not just modern history, but the entire Western civilization, should be studying these 20 core topics, starting with ancient Rome and Greece, and then going straight through the history of Christianity, and a linear study of history, ending up with the Cold War. And interestingly, none of the academics have come back to me and criticised me on that. Nobody said anything about the 20 core. All they've said is, no, we don't teach identity politics. But no one's actually said.
Teaches the narrative.
Nobody said. Nobody's criticised us for saying the narrative should be taught. So that's really what we propose. Now the problem is, who do you find that can teach the entire history of Western civilization of the last 2,000 years? And I think we're going to struggle in this country to find someone that can confidently teach undergraduates this kind of history, which is why Simon Haynes going to the US.
Yeah. Thanks, Bella.
Can I just
yes, please do.
Very briefly. Thanks, Bella. Just to come back to the terms of your questions, Stephen, I think that don't feel qualified to speak specifically about the Frankfurt School, but the way in which society is analysed by thinkers who emerged from the Frankfurt School, I think has led it, or has been one of the factors contributing to identity politics, which we've talked about this morning. And I think that identity politics really is a very grave threat to the cohesiveness of our society because, as Bella said, it casts society in terms of victims and oppressors. And when one group is always presented as a victim and the rest of society is the oppressor, we're setting up a situation for conflict and struggle. And that is very divisive. And one of my concerns in my work is that anti-discrimination law has been used a great deal by proponents of identity politics in the name of eradicating oppression, effectively to divide members of society one from another, because we are identified not as individuals, which I think is extremely important, but as members of an identifiable group. And when conflict between those groups emerges, diversity is eradicated, and diversity is eradicated in the name of fairness or equality. It means that, in fact, we're undermining in the long term the social cohesiveness of our entire society. And that's why I think identity politics is actually so dangerous.
Okay, I've got a question up here, but first I want to go to the student at the back.
Cheers. So I was going to ask this question to Reverend Kurti, but I'm sure Professor Kasper and Dr. Davera might have some views on this as well, particularly regarding the Judeo-Christian heritage of our society and of Western civilization. I'm sure many people will be aware in recent years that there's been very strong growth in the amount of people who identify as not having a religion in Australia and in other Western countries. We also had a very strong growth in people who identify with religions that aren't Judeo-Christian in origin, such as, say, Islam, Buddhism, etc. What impacts do you believe that's going to have on Western civilization in the future, on the Judeo-Christian heritage that actually contributes towards Western civilization and the future of Western civilization?
Sorry, to be specific, what is the factor you're concerned about?
What impact will the growth in Western society of people who are Judeo-Christian going to have on Judeo-Christian heritage of our society and the future of it?
I think it's a very good question. I just want to say, when talking about the importance of the Judeo-Christian contribution to our society, I said, as I said in my remarks, you don't have to believe that it's true. You just have to recognize the fact that it makes an important contribution, and that the principles that we derive from Judeo-Christian theology are principles that are threaded through our society. But I think you can accept that without believing that it's true. I think if we're not careful about protecting, if we're not careful about articulating and defending the importance of the Judeo-Christian contribution to Western society, we will find that the nature of our secular society changes. And if, in the name of aggressive, radical secularism, we find that religion is squeezed increasingly from the public sphere, from the public space, from the open realm of discourse and engagement, it will be that much harder for any people of faith to manifest their religion openly and freely. Because people will sometimes say, oh, but you know, you're free to believe. Of course there's freedom to believe. You can believe the moon is made of cheese. The state can't can't determine what you believe. But the point comes when you want to manifest and practice your religion in public. And I think we have to defend the importance of religion, starting with Judeo-Christianity, because if we don't defend it, we'll find that the opportunities to exercise religious freedom, as we're seeing at the moment, are becoming increasingly constrained. One of the things that frustrates me, though, in this wider conversation is that people who are very quick to condemn the contribution of Judeo-Christianity, and Christianity in particular, are very, very slow to say anything about Islam. One of my sparring partners, and I have great admiration for him, but we disagree about a lot of things, is David Marr. And I've said to David, well, you know, David goes on and on and on. He thinks that Christians are obsessed with sex, whereas in my view, David is obsessed with sex. We're always talking about sex. And if you're watching David, you know what I mean. But when I asked David, I said, well, you don't say, and he goes on and on about Anglican Christians in Sydney who have done this, that, and the other to determine that it's illegal for gays and lesbians to have sex in certain kinds of ways. Well, yes, I mean, that has been a point of contention, and I think our society is changing and it's evolving. But nobody says anything about what traditional Islam says about homosexuality. To take one example, that is never addressed. We don't talk about what the imams are talking about, what the imams are preaching to their congregations. And I think that there is a tendency to think that the harm comes with Christianity and only Christianity. And why I think it's important to defend the place of the Judeo-Christian contribution to Western civilization is that we need to be mindful that actually Christianity, and Wolfgang really touched on this in his opening remarks, Christianity is a very, very different system of belief than Islam is. And if we're not careful, those differences will collide, and we will find that things actually are a lot more difficult for all people of religious belief. So that's how I respond to your question. Bella? Wolfgang, you may say something.
I look at it in terms of the more that Christianity rescinds from society and creates a vacuum, that vacuum will naturally be filled with something that is stronger and has stronger beliefs, whether they're good beliefs or bad beliefs. And I think that's, at the moment, Islam has a very strong presence and it has a visible presence. To the rest of the society, it looks very cohesive. You have the mother, you have the father, you have the children, you have the sort of the marriage idea. It looks very stable compared to what's happening in the secular and the Christian parts of our society. So I think the danger is that as Christianity disappears and secularism and people become more, and your average Australian doesn't believe in anything, then they'll be subsumed by a system that is stronger and has a stronger belief in itself and stronger beliefs, and that's Islam.
Couldn't have put that better. When the majority is indifferent, doesn't care, a resolute minority can dominate politics. And that's what's happening increasingly. The vocal minorities, let's beware of them. But of course, I talked about the complacent society. It's comfortable. We're not really threatened. We have a good life. It's the wealthy who stay. We enjoy television, shallow entertainment. Why take the trouble of taking them on? Who has read the Quran here in this room? Well, that's pretty good. Inshallah, 3, 4. It's an uncomfortable read. And
know thy enemy.
Sorry?
Know thy enemy.
Yes, indeed. So all the others who haven't raised their hands, you have already a reading assignment.
Can we pick up a question just here, please? And we're going to go on a lightning round.
Thank you. Brian O'Brien in physics. I can assure you the moon isn't made of cheese. Bella, you're talking about the law as black letter law generally, and we just focus on that, not the fuzzy stuff through the bureaucrats. Historically, as you've said, it evolves with gradual development over generations or hundreds of years or whatever. These days, however, a vocal minority with the influence of social communications can, as we know well, lead to laws changing zap. How effectively can you introduce logic and reason into that second process?
While the microphone's going back, can I get the question here? Yes.
Chris McCarthy, Mannkal scholar. In the aftermath of the same-sex marriage debate, we've got a call for religious protections, citing freedom of speech. And universities used to be the ultimate forum for the free exchange of thoughts and ideas, but we have Christian universities with the word university in their name that are cautioning students who are talking about beliefs and practices that are not consistent with the Christian faith and values of the university. How can you reconcile that as a Christian lobby calling for freedom of speech?
Can we just get one more question up the back? Down the very back, we've got a historian here.
Yes, standing here both as a history academic and a political moderate, but Andrew did assure me there would be a safe space provided for me at some point today. And the question's directed to Bella, and I think I was saying to Andrew earlier that we're coming to a lot of the same conclusions, but probably for different reasons. I've actually got to run off to a farewell lunch for a colleague now in the history department. But something I wanted to introduce, perhaps to discuss this afternoon, and when I come back sort of later this afternoon and this evening, is how our universities are being run, because I think there's this sort of mistake that sometimes comes out amongst crowds like this, that it's these sort of liberal, politically correct academics who don't want to run these courses. And certainly what I'm finding in my experience is it's actually academics versus this sort of bloated managerial class of highly overpaid vice-chancellors, deputy vice-chancellors who are really pushing us to run these enormous broadening units, these massive survey courses. Your comments about British history, as a British historian, I agree with completely. I give a lecture on the Magna Carta, the Oxford Provisions, the Glorious Revolution, but because of the nature of the broadening course it's in, I have to do all that in 45 minutes, and that's all the kids get in terms of that. So I was wondering if, as I sort of exit, we could sort of start to sort of address that about how universities are run, because it does sort of worry me a little bit about academics sort of being treated as the enemy, because I think you'll find, and we'll talk about this perhaps more when the cameras are off and later on the cocktail, that a lot of academics would agree with you and the points that you're making.
Yep. So we have three comments. I've taken notes. The first one, reason and reintroducing that. Response of the Christian lobby to recent social debate, or response in light of same-sex marriage, and the state of our universities. So Bella, do you want to kick off? You can choose what you want to answer.
I think I'll address the last one because it's more relevant to my area. I've also had a lot of emails recently from academics saying I'm surrounded by other academics who I'm quite alienated. I'm the only one in the department who believes these things. So I think it might depend on your institution. But I do agree that the problem is at a level of the people who run these places. So do we sack them all? I don't know. I mean, do we start again? Do we start infiltrating universities and putting our people in positions of power? And I mean, I don't know what the solution is when you have when it's that endemic, when it goes from the vice chancellor down. I don't know if you know Jonathan Haidt's Heterodox Society. I don't know if you're a member of that, but then that's probably a good way of starting at that level. Yeah, we'll talk it.
Yep. Wolfgang, do you want?
One way to talk to your vice chancellor who wants to attract fee-paying students is this: go to Asia and see how people want to know about Western history. What's our secret? Maybe if there's a general course, we don't need 20 specialist lecturers to give that, on the grand narrative of Western history. Maybe that's the way to tell your vice chancellor to push more for a subject that fee-paying students attract. There is a new museum on the history of Beijing in China, where if you go around the circle, you learn everything from Peking Man to Mao. But the interesting thing for me when I went through is on the outer wall, they have the parallel history of the West. What happened when Peking Man was moseying around? There was first European, etc., up to the present. And most fathers and children spend more time in front of the exhibit about the West than looking inward to the Peking history. Tell your Vice Chancellor that.
Thank you. I'd like to address your question, which is an interesting one. I was trying to think, I can't think of a Christian university in Australia that falls foul of this, and you may not want to name it on the camera.
I can't name my own university.
Okay, I might.
What's your recommendation?
All right, I think I can guess. I'll have a word with you afterwards. I don't think I can reconcile those positions because I think they're irreconcilable, and I do think that a university, and I think we'll be moving more into this in the course of the afternoon, which is good. A university should be a place where all ideas are open for discussion, and that's where that may be the case, but I'm saying it's not reconcilable because I think that it's not something I would want to defend. I think that people have to be able to explore ideas and need to encounter ideas, because if young people, let's assume that most students are young, I think they are still, if they go to university with unformed minds, as it were, and they come out with, as it were, deformed minds because of a failure to to address the range of topics that they might need to address, then I think the university is failing. I mean, it was interesting, the idea that people might, Bella was talking about this in her talk, that students might decide what it was that they wanted to learn. My first degree was in law, and I think if we'd been asked, do you want to learn the law of real property? Is that something that appeals to you? Most of us would have said no, because it was conceptually difficult, and it was actually quite dry until you got a certain way into it. But we had to do it, because if you wanted to have a degree in law, you had to have a component that dealt with property law. So the idea that students are asked what they want to learn is really a very odd one indeed. But broadly, I think that I believe completely in the freedom of speech. I think people should be able to discuss freely matters that are of concern to them, and that they need to be concerned about, and that there should be no attempt, particularly in universities, to censor that sort of discussion.
Thanks. I think we've got one last question over there, then we'll have a final word from the panel.
Thanks. Charles Smith, I'm a member of the Legislative Council here in Western Australia. Reverend, you briefly talked about the existence of a covenant between the government and the people, and that's coming from our Judeo-Christian heritage. I'm quite interested in the social contract as defined by Burke when he talked about there being a contract between people who are living, who have died, and people who are yet to be born. Do you still think the social contract is an important concept? And if so, how do we re-engage that amongst the Australian people?
That's a really good question. Thank you, that's a really good question. The covenant was actually, that I was referring to briefly at the end, was this idea, covenant not between government and people, but between people themselves. So covenant informs the way in which we relate to one another as members of society. That covenant is something that binds us in that relationship. Of course, the social contract was developed in particular by Rousseau, but Burke did in fact speak about that relationship between the people, the past, the present, and the future. And I think that we see government in Australia struggling with this to an extent, because there is an insatiable demand on the part of the electorate to have their particular needs met now. And they want their needs met now, and once they're satisfied, the future can take care of itself. And I think it's very difficult for democratically elected governments, which have to be democratically elected, to get ahead of the electorate on this one, to as it were, set the terms under which government can be conducted. The government in New South Wales is of a different complexion from the government here in this state, but we face very similar issues, I think. How does government reconnect with the Australian people? I don't have a quick answer to that, and if I did, I'd probably get a lot of money peddling it around the country, because I think we do have a crisis of political confidence in this country, and I think there are low levels of trust between the governed and the governing. But that sense, I think, of a covenant between Australians, past, present, and future, is a good way of thinking about how it is we form policy now. The one area in which, of course, it is promoted vigorously is in the area of environmentalism and climate change. We're continuously being warned that we have to pay high prices for electricity with the risk in South Australia of blackouts, because we need to be responsible for the welfare of future generations. Well, we're seeing how if the pendulum swings too far in terms of safeguarding the interests of the future, we are in danger of neglecting the needs of those who actually are alive now. But it's one example of the way in which it's good to think along between the generations and think in intergenerational terms. The Howard government seemed to begin to do this quite well. I think we've lost sight of it federally in the last 10 years. I don't know where we're going. I don't have an answer, but I think the point you make is a very important one, and it's one of the challenges of government, I think, to establish a connection between all past the living and the past, the present, and the future. If we lose sight of those who've gone before, and we have no regard for those who are to come, I think we are going to experience, in a way, a breakdown of that social cohesion upon which we depend. Thank you. It's a good question. Do you want to say anything?
Wolfgang, do you want?
As an economist.
No, I'm not here as an economist. I'm too old for that. the problem of loyalty and trust in the elites, in government in particular, is a general problem in Western societies, in Western democracies these days. If we only look at Australia and say this is the worst in the world, I invite you to go to Europe and have a good look around. It's broken down much more than here. But we should get inspiration from countries where this is not so strong. And I would recommend that you look at Switzerland, a country that no one here studies. There, people still trust the government. They partake actively. The public square is alive with ideas. Open, no restrictions on speech and motions to change the law. Let's not only look at those sick countries which have inspired us, and that includes Britain, that includes France, that includes Germany. Look at those countries where things are still healthy and learn a bit more from them. Thank you.